Book plot. The bestseller book Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus is about women's lives, jobs, and the fight for equality in the late 1950s and early 1960s. It centers on Elizabeth Zott, a talented scientist who becomes a television chef after becoming a young, unmarried mother. Copywriter and creative director Bonnie Garmus has experience in the technological, medical, and educational sectors. Her debut book, Lessons in Chemistry, shot to national blockbuster status after its release. The book examines themes of sexism in the workplace, the limitations placed on women's aspirations, parenthood, and the significance of family via Elizabeth's tale. Elizabeth Zott, the star of the well-adored cookery program Dinner at 6, packs her daughter Madeline's school lunch in November 1961 while unhappy and before leaving for work. Elizabeth walked into the KCTV television station to confront Walter Pine about his daughter Amanda taking Madeline's lunches, which is how Dinner at 6 came to be. Walter was astounded by Elizabeth's brilliance, elegance, and prowess in the kitchen. Elizabeth grudgingly agreed to the notion of the culinary program. In January 1952, nearly 10 years earlier, Elizabeth works as a chemist at the Hastings Research Institute. Her enrollment in the UCLA PhD program was revoked after she was sexually abused by her advisor, Dr. Myers, and she stabbed him with a pencil. She had previously applied to the program as a doctoral candidate. After she takes several beakers from his lab at Hastings, she meets Calvin Evans, a fellow researcher at the institute and a smart and well-known chemist. After first mistaking her for a secretary, Calvin subsequently apologizes and asks Elizabeth out. She rejects, but a few months later they run into one another again and develop a relationship. Calvin offers to help out after Donati, the director of chemistry at Hastings, forbids Elizabeth from carrying out her research on abiogenesis. The two then start to collaborate. They finally fall in love, and everyone in their workplace enviously admires their union. Calvin and Elizabeth gradually start to share tidbits of their distinct upbringings. Elizabeth's mother got a divorce from her father, a religious con artist who ended up in jail, and she fled to Brazil. As his parents found out about his homosexuality and tormented him for it, Elizabeth's brother committed suicide. After the terrible deaths of his family in accidents, Calvin was raised in a boys' home. Calvin doesn't tell Elizabeth that he was truly adopted because he believes his biological father, a wealthy man who made substantial gifts to Calvin's boys' home, despite never having met his son, is still alive. A former pen buddy named Wakely, who stopped communicating with Calvin when the latter said that he despises his father and wishes him dead, is the only person to whom Calvin has revealed this. Over time, as Calvin's work gained notoriety, he started getting letters from people identifying themselves as long-lost relatives. Although one lady repeatedly wrote to Calvin pretending to be his mother and giving him money for his studies, Calvin's father never sent him a letter. Calvin and Elizabeth jointly move in. They decide against having children and she declines to marry him. Instead, they adopt 630, an extremely sensitive and clever dog. Elizabeth is taught how to row by Calvin, a college-level rower, who also introduces her to Dr. Mason, the head coach of the men's team at the neighborhood boathouse. Calvin stumbles and strikes his head on the pavement while out for a morning run with 630. He passes away practically instantly. Elizabeth is crushed by Calvin's passing and also learns she is expecting Calvin's kid. Recently, a wealthy benefactor expressed interest in supporting abiogenesis research. Donati had deceived the investor into believing that Elizabeth was a guy named Mr. Zott, and he then used that information to steal the money intended for Elizabeth's project. Elizabeth is fired by Donati after Hastings secretary Miss Frask leaks information about her pregnancy that might reveal Donati's con. Elizabeth now only spends her time working or rowing since Calvin's passing. Elizabeth's Hastings co-workers start coming to her house for home consultations regarding their job, and she starts charging them for the time so she can pay her bills. In order to continue working on her study, she demolishes the kitchen in her flat and replaces it with a lab. Dr. Mason, an obstetrician, eventually meets Elizabeth late in her pregnancy. He is surprised to see that she is still rowing, but urges her to keep going because it appears to be increasing her strength and endurance. 2 weeks before her due date, Madeline is born. Elizabeth, who is overburdened, receives assistance from her neighbor, Harriet Sloane, who starts to routinely check on Elizabeth and assist with Madeline. Elizabeth registers Madeline for kindergarten when she turns 4. Donati, who is being pursued by the abiogenesis investor, employs Elizabeth back, but this time as a lab worker when she goes to Hastings to look for work. At Hastings, Elizabeth bumps into Frask once more. As the two women clash, it is discovered that Frask had also been sexually attacked by her advisor and expelled from her PhD program. Dr. Borewitz is one of the scientists Donati enlists to assist him to steal all of Elizabeth's abiogenesis research and publish it under his own name. Elizabeth storms out of Hastings. By covertly giving Elizabeth all of Calvin's notes and unfinished work that had been put in storage at Hastings, Frask makes peace with Elizabeth. Elizabeth finds all of Calvin's old letters in these boxes, including those from his penfriend Wakely. Elizabeth gets a call from Walter Pine, who she faced in the TV studio, a few days after quitting her position at Hastings, regarding a prospective show. Elizabeth accepts his offer since she is desperate for money. Phil Lebensmull, Walter's supervisor, gives Walter the order to make Elizabeth appear sexy on television. Nevertheless, Elizabeth refuses to wear any of the suggested outfits, ignores the cue cards Walter lays out for her, and integrates scientific guidance and information into all of her on-air presentations. Although Elizabeth makes the audience of housewives feel noticed and valued, Lebensmull is enraged by the show's popularity. Having snooped through Calvin's correspondence earlier, Harriet informs Madeline that Calvin had a fairy godmother, the benefactor at the boys' home. Wakely, who is now a reverend, is encountered by Madeline when she enters the library to learn more about the residents. Wakely learns that Madeline is Calvin Evans' daughter, and offers to contact the correct address on Madeline's behalf to assist her in finding the proper house. Because of the problems that Calvin Evans has previously given him, the bishop makes an effort to avoid Wakely's call. Years ago, the bishop pretended that Calvin Evans was dead to get financing when a wealthy man arrived seeking him. As Calvin gained notoriety and the foundation learned of the bishop's deception, they were so upset that they immediately stopped sponsoring the orphanage. When Wakely eventually gets through to the bishop, he unintentionally spills information about the Parker Foundation to Wakely, who then tells Madeline about it. On a cookery show program, Elizabeth insults a possible sponsor. As Elizabeth takes out her chef's knife to defend herself from Lebensmull's attempted sexual assault, the enraged man suffers a heart attack. As Walter takes over as acting executive producer, he wins new, very lucrative sponsorship and syndication arrangements for the program. Elizabeth learns that the show has several new sponsorship and syndication opportunities. When Life magazine asks Elizabeth for an interview, she grudgingly agrees, after being persuaded by Walter and Harriet. Franklin Roth, the writer, ends up finding out everything about her history, but Roth still writes an article praising Elizabeth's scientific achievements without mentioning any personal information. But Roth's editor publishes a completely different story using comments from Donati and Myers that portrays Elizabeth as a beautiful but unproductive lady. Elizabeth experiences betrayal and depressive symptoms. Roth leaves Life magazine and attempts to publish his work in scholarly journals, but is turned down by many journals. He sends the article over to Elizabeth. Madeline receives and reads it instead and takes it to Wakely. She meets Frask, who is now working as Wakely's typist. Frask reads Roth's new article and, incensed on Elizabeth's behalf, sends a letter to the editors of Life denouncing the piece they have run. Her letter is run in the next edition of Life, along with those of many others. A conversation with Wakely leads Elizabeth to realize that she wants to get back to scientific work, and she quits the show. She receives no job offers, but months later Frask calls her and asks her to come to Hastings. After reading Frask's letter in Life, the Parker Foundation, which had provided financing for abiogenesis, started looking into Donati. Frask is promoted to head of personnel after his numerous transgressions are discovered. Donati is let go, and Elizabeth is allowed to become the head of chemistry. The founder of the Parker Foundation, Avery Parker, confesses that she is Calvin's real mother, and that she was compelled to place Calvin for adoption after becoming pregnant while still a teen. Wilson, her attorney, was the person Calvin had seen at the residence, and was appointed on her behalf when Calvin's adoptive parents passed away. Avery started writing to her son after learning that the bishop had lied about Calvin's death. Calvin had passed away before their meeting. Elizabeth cordially extends an invitation to Avery to join the family and meet Madeline. Elizabeth resumes her abiogenesis study in her lab at Hastings as the book comes to a close. Chapter 1. November 1961. Elizabeth Zott, 30, gets up every day before dawn in November 1961, feeling as though her life is coming to an end. "It is not your imagination, most people are horrible," she says in one of the notes she tucks inside Madeline's lunchbox as she prepared lunch for her. Madeline, who is just 5 years old but is already a proficient reader, pretends to be illiterate like her peers to fit in at school. She quietly removes these messages from the lunchbox each morning and tucks them away before heading off to school. Madeline aspires to fit in since she observes how her mother has struggled throughout her life, despite never fitting in. Elizabeth, who is despondent, bids Madeline farewell before heading to the television studio to film the episode of Dinner at 6, in which she is the star. Chapter 2. Pine. Research chemist is what Elizabeth used to be. Madeline was found for dinner at 6 because Amanda Pine, a little girl, was regularly consuming Madeline's school lunches. Madeline started to provide Amanda, the one student in her class who didn't make fun of Madeline, with her lunches out of friendship because Elizabeth always made them hearty and delicious. Madeline started to lose weight over time, and Elizabeth eventually realized what was going on. Walter Pine, Amanda's father, worked at a television studio, so Elizabeth went there right once to confront him about Amanda's larceny. Walter suggested that Elizabeth host a program that teaches the entire nation to make food that matters, after being astounded by her beauty, presence, and superior knowledge and talents in the kitchen. Elizabeth reluctantly agreed. Although she is a scientist and not a cook, she did so since the greater money would enable her to better support Madeline. 4 weeks later, Dinner at 6 made its premiere. Elizabeth and her program immediately gained popularity, despite being more serious and direct than the hosts of other culinary shows. She always concludes each episode with the infamous phrase, "Children, prepare the table. Your mum requires some alone time." Yet after 2 years, a show-related article referred to Elizabeth as Luscious Lizzie, and the moniker caught on. Madeline notices how the moniker minimizes her mother's abilities, and Elizabeth herself starts to feel embarrassed and self-conscious. She considers how her life has arrived at this point as she lies awake at night, all thanks to a guy by the name of Calvin Evans. Chapter 3. Hastings Research Institute. Elizabeth and Calvin Evans are both employed by the Hastings Research Institute in January 1952. Calvin is a scientific prodigy with a lab of his own, a reputation for intelligence, impatience, and the capacity to keep a grudge. He has already achieved a great deal. The only other activity Calvin enjoys as much as chemistry is rowing. After earning his doctorate from Cambridge, he turned down many higher-ranking offers in favor of a job at Hastings, because the weather in Commons, California, was ideal for rowing. When Elizabeth enters Calvin's lab to borrow some beakers since the one she works in is running low, they end up becoming friends. Elizabeth becomes upset when Calvin rejects her because he thinks she is a secretary, and she picks up a box of beakers and marches out despite Calvin's protests. After finding her a week later, Calvin regrets his error and asks Elizabeth out on a date, which she declines. A lab technician who witnesses this incident informs Elizabeth that Calvin is notorious for harboring resentments, and is appalled to learn that Elizabeth had taken the beakers from Calvin. Elizabeth, who harbors her own resentments but reserves them for a patriarchal society, founded on the idea that women were less capable, intelligent, or inventive, is intrigued by this. Elizabeth ignores the lab technician's request that she makes up to Calvin. The next morning, however, someone else has given Calvin the beakers, and Elizabeth's colleagues are being unkind to her because they think she put their lab in danger by provoking Calvin. Elizabeth overhears them disparaging her, and when her employer Donati uses the slur "C," she becomes nauseous because she is reminded of the last time she heard it when she was a student at UCLA. Only a few days before receiving her master's degree, Elizabeth was working late one night when she was sexually raped by her advisor Dr. Myers, who called her the same slur. Elizabeth used a number 2 pencil to stab Dr. Myers as a form of self-defense, but the police didn't take her word for it. Dr. Myers disseminated the rumor that after he discovered Elizabeth cheating on a research, she offered to have sex with him to keep him quiet. When he declined, she allegedly stabbed him out of rage. Dr. Myers was influential enough at UCLA that Elizabeth's entrance to the PhD program was withdrawn, and she had been forced to depart with just her master's degree, even though he already had a reputation as a lecher and no one believed the allegation. Donati reassigns Elizabeth to a low-level amino acid study after the incident with Calvin and the beakers, even though Elizabeth was the one who started the group research project. She bumps into Calvin at the theater one evening. He is ill and unintentionally throws up all over her. Calvin apologizes to Elizabeth for throwing up on her and for thinking she was a secretary when they first met, and Elizabeth helps him go home. Elizabeth and Calvin are having coffee when she informs him that her intended research of abiogenesis was changed to a less challenging one. She explains how sex prejudice has contributed to it when Calvin expresses surprise that she was denied the opportunity to continue working on something so crucial. Elizabeth unwillingly accepts Calvin's offer to assist her by telling Donati that her study is needed for Calvin's project, but she makes it plain that this is just business and nothing personal. Chapter 4. Introduction to Chemistry. Calvin and Elizabeth are drawn to one another after 3 weeks. Calvin misunderstands Elizabeth's attempt to express her sentiments by bringing up scientific research on silkworms and pheromones and assumes that she is rejecting him. They part ways, only for Calvin to reappear and vehemently deny that they have a problem with him. Indulging in her feelings, Elizabeth kisses Calvin, cementing a permanent bond that even chemistry could not explain with their first kiss. Chapter 5. Family Values. Deeply in love with one another, Calvin and Elizabeth's relationship is intellectually and creatively engaging for both parties. They discuss practically everything over a few months, except their families. Right before Thanksgiving, Calvin brings up the matter by asking Elizabeth if she'll be returning home for the holiday. When he was 5 years old, his parents were killed by a train, and the aunt who raised him also passed away 2 years later, according to Calvin. He doesn't go into detail, but he was reared in a Catholic boys' home in Iowa, and had a difficult upbringing. Elizabeth's mother assisted her father, a God salesman, who preached about the end of the world, and made money by peddling amulets and baptisms that would stave it off. Because of his charisma, oratory prowess, and ability to produce spontaneous combustion using chemistry, a topic he taught to Elizabeth, he was incredibly persuasive. She also had an older brother who, after learning he was gay and being called an aberration by his parents, committed himself. Elizabeth was close to her brother, and was essentially left alone when he passed away because her parents frequently traveled for their jobs. Despite not having had formal education, she learned how to be independent and taught herself through books from the library. In the end, Elizabeth's father was caught and imprisoned after one of his miracles went awry and murdered 3 people, while Elizabeth's mother remarried, divorced, and relocated to Brazil to avoid extradition for tax evasion. After a while, Calvin and Elizabeth fall asleep, not meaning to continue talking about their own families or divulging any more information. Chapter 6. The Hastings Cafeteria. Because of how content they are together, Calvin and Elizabeth are the envy of their co-workers. They are the targets of vicious cafeteria rumors, especially those spread by Miss Frask, a personnel secretary. When Elizabeth and Calvin decide to live together, Elizabeth offers to cook 5 dinners per week as a trade for services rendered, because she is unable to pay half the rent with her much lesser wage. Despite Calvin's 3 Nobel nominations in 5 years, she declines to work in his lab because she doesn't want to be perceived as piggybacking on his success when it comes to her research. Elizabeth also states emphatically that she has no plans to be married. However, Calvin buys a diamond ring and carries it around for 3 months, waiting for the appropriate opportunity. At lunch in the cafeteria one day, Elizabeth informs Calvin about a last-minute invitation she has received to be a bridesmaid in a wedding. As their co-workers covertly observe the event, Calvin takes out the ring box and pops the question, thinking this would make a fantastic moment. Elizabeth declines Calvin because she doesn't want to be married and starts going by Mrs. Calvin Evans, which will still happen even if she keeps her name. Elizabeth's rejection has Calvin fuming and furious. Having received letters from alleged long-lost relatives, which happens frequently now that he is well-known, he was already having a bad morning. A great-uncle wanted Calvin to invest in his alchemy scheme. A sad mother claimed to be his biological mother and wanted to give him money. A so-called cousin needed cash, one of the letters read. Calvin begs Elizabeth to think twice, and emphasizes how crucial it is for him to have a family. While they've already discussed it and decided they won't have children, Elizabeth is immediately shocked and believes Calvin is suggesting they have a kid. Calvin interjects to clarify that he was only making a dog-related suggestion. As the two of them kiss and make up, their co-workers watch in profound jealousy, which relieves Elizabeth. Chapter 7. 6:30. A month later, Elizabeth returns from the grocery store with a mangy puppy, who follows her home. He is called 6:30, since that is the time Calvin and Elizabeth first see him. 6:30 seemed to want to stay, despite their efforts to find his owner. The canine 6:30 is exceptionally bright and fast to take up a new language. He used to attend a camp at the nearby Marine base as a canine bomb sniffer trainee. However, Calvin and Elizabeth are unaware of this. 6:30 was able to detect the explosives, but he failed his training because he was too terrified to approach them. 6:30 was then abandoned by his handler in the middle of the road, and he ultimately found his way to the alleyway where he had followed Elizabeth home. 6:30 is started to travel to Hastings with Calvin and Elizabeth, and no one is brave enough to confront Calvin about bringing the dog in. Elizabeth starts preparing all of their meals, gradually. Instead of some preordained feminine duty, chemistry is what it is to her. She notes and follows all mealtime instructions just like she would a chemical equation. Calvin chooses to give Elizabeth a rowing lesson. She first objects, but ultimately gives up because she wants to demonstrate that women can row too. Elizabeth is taken by Calvin to the boathouse where he demonstrates proper erg technique to her. Despite Elizabeth's reservations, Calvin tells the other boathouse patrons that Elizabeth is his new rowing partner. Upon hearing this, everyone looks at Elizabeth with fresh amazement, which makes Elizabeth understand that Calvin is also regarded as talented in this profession. Chapter 8. Overreaching. Calvin's first meetings with Elizabeth are a complete disaster, and she frequently causes their boat to capsize. She researches the mechanics of rowing when Calvin corrects her on her understanding of the subject. Elizabeth rows flawlessly during their subsequent practice, as she puts the conceptual understanding she has learned into practice. Donati declines Elizabeth's desire to work on abiogenesis, saying that she is not intellectually capable of doing so. He discovers Elizabeth had been rowing when he examines her bandaged fingers. The fact that Donati himself was a rower, and had competed against Calvin in that sport while they were both in college, only served to intensify his dislike for Evans. Elizabeth is knowledgeable and outspoken, the reverse of what Donati thinks women should be, which makes him despise her even more. He reiterates to Elizabeth that she is not intelligent enough to work on abiogenesis, because he wants to destroy her self-esteem. Dr. Borowitz, Elizabeth's lab partner, approaches her, as she from Donati's office was furious, and inquires about his study. Borowitz, who struggles with his work, frequently asks Elizabeth for assistance, as do many others when no one else is around. Calvin confronts Donati furiously, and insists that he permit Elizabeth to continue her studies, threatening to quit Hastings if he doesn't, despite Elizabeth expressly informing him that she doesn't require his assistance. Despite Calvin's intervention, Donati is compelled to reassign Elizabeth to her work on the abiogenesis project, after a large benefactor unexpectedly shows up at the institute and requests funding for this specific field of study. Calvin, who thinks he orchestrated everything, is ecstatic as well. When Elizabeth asks Calvin whether he had anything to do with it, Calvin tells her he had never spoken to Donati. Calvin asks Dr. Mason, the head coach of the men's crew at the boathouse, whether he will let Calvin and Elizabeth join the squad. Dr. Mason accepts it despite his skepticism, and Calvin and Elizabeth join the team in their argument. Calvin completely disagrees with Elizabeth's assessment that her performance was subpar. Chapter 9. The Grudge. Calvin has vowed to detest a certain individual from his past till the day he dies. When Calvin was 10 years old, a dapperly dressed guy paid a visit to the boy's home where he resided. The house started getting scientific textbooks, chemistry sets, and other math and science supplies a month following the man's visit. Over time, Calvin discovered that the man, whom the bishop claimed to be Calvin's biological father, forced the home to accept the material to also obtain funds from him. He had come looking for the youngster, whose adoptive parents had perished in a railway accident. The bishop claimed that Calvin's real mother had passed away at birth, and his biological father was unable to care for the child by displaying an adoption certificate and a death certificate. This time, after reviewing Calvin's dossier, the guy decided it would be best for Calvin to remain at the home, and left after making a sizable contribution to the facility to support science and athletics. Calvin ate up all the scientific books and supplies that arrived in the interim, holding out hope that his father would return and take him. He eventually developed a hatred for his father, since he never came home, and disowned Calvin before they had even spoken. Chapters 1-9 Analysis. The heroine of Lessons in Chemistry, Elizabeth Zott, the wildly successful and equally sad star of a television cookery program, is introduced in a clear, vivid way in the book's first scene. Early on, Madeline, Elizabeth's daughter, draws attention to her mother's peculiarity. This peculiarity becomes clearer as the novel develops, especially in light of the socio-historical setting of the book. Elizabeth is a talented scientist in her late 50s, confident enough to defy authority, and bright enough to inspire jealousy. She is depicted as being quite lovely, and when she appears on television, her appearance garners enormous support due to her serious and direct demeanor. Elizabeth is focused on her career and her desire to be self-sufficient. She refuses to marry Calvin or work in his lab even after they start dating, because she is certain that she would not be perceived as following in his footsteps. The drive to maintain independence is a result of Elizabeth's upbringing. One key component is her family. She was forced to fend for herself at an early age owing to the neglect she felt from her absent parents and the passing of her sibling. Despite Myers' repeated attempts to sexually abuse her and the persistent invalidation of her research abilities, Elizabeth learns to be self-sufficient. In the latter event, Elizabeth shamelessly stabs Myers with her pencil in self-defense, demonstrating the strong sense of self and resourcefulness she has accumulated over the years. One of the many situations in the book that refers to one of its main themes, sexism and harassment in the workplace, is Myers' attempted sexual assault. Although Myers physically abuses Elizabeth, the police officers discount her claims. Myers is an important scientist, but more importantly, in this historical period, he is an influential man. Although no one at the institution believed his account of the events due to Myers' reputation, Elizabeth is the one who is forced to leave. Donati reassigns Elizabeth to a low-level amino acid study, even though Elizabeth was the driving force behind the considerably more complex group research, in a similar demonstration of the type of authority males wielded in the workplace. This type of power disparity that existed in the workplace at this period in history is exemplified by the characters Donati, Myers, and even Borowitz. Myers and Donati both use the C word to refer to Elizabeth, and while Borowitz does not directly attack or harass her, he eventually goes on to take credit for her efforts. Even Calvin, one of Elizabeth's most ardent supporters, first mistakes her for a secretary, demonstrating the extent to which sexist beliefs pervaded the workplace. Also, the concept of the circumscription of women's aspirations by the patriarchy is introduced in these beginning chapters. Even though she is a very well-liked television star who largely defies expectations, the article, Luscious Lizzie, that minimizes her accomplishments to her appearance, serves as an example of how women are reduced to stereotypes in a way that even a young Madeline recognizes as unfair and inaccurate. To fit in at her school, Madeline pretends to be illiterate, therefore she experiences a similar pressure. Even in Elizabeth's earlier career as a research chemist, Donati, who hates Elizabeth for being so intelligent and outspoken, first turns down her request to carry on with her study of abiogenesis. He tells her that she is not intelligent enough to do the task, in an obvious effort to undermine her self-esteem. The novel also highlights the various ways people reinterpret and find meaning in new narratives as an alternative to the prescriptive narratives of the period. The focus of the book is re-examining the meaning of family, which questions the true significance of biological relationships and investigates what makes up a family. In contrast, Calvin's naive belief that families always provide stability is challenged when he meets Elizabeth, whose family has only caused her suffering. Calvin was reared in a boys' home and never had a genuine family. Because he was raised without a family, Calvin is drawn to marriage. Yet, Elizabeth's adamant opposition makes Calvin realize that a family may be formed without a marriage contract or even children. As a result, Elizabeth and Calvin cohabitate unmarried and without kids. Instead, they have 630, a remarkable canine intellect. In addition to Walter Pine and Dr. Mason, additional characters introduced in these chapters include Elizabeth, Madeline, Calvin, and 630. As the tale goes on, Walter, who works at KCTV and was key in the development of Dinner at 6, becomes increasingly significant in Elizabeth's life. As an obstetrician who also serves as the team leader for the local boathouse's men's rowing squad, Dr. Mason is briefly presented. 3 motifs recur throughout the book, and all are introduced in these initial chapters: chemistry, cooking, and rowing. Chemistry is Elizabeth's profession and passion, a field she excels in and shares in common with Calvin. Cooking is something that Elizabeth excels in as well, and despite it being a conventionally feminine arena, Elizabeth does it with interest and joy. This is because she views it as chemistry, and not as a preordained duty, speaking to Elizabeth's character as a deeply rational person, rather than a rebel for the sake of being unconventional. Finally, rowing is something that Calvin is passionate about, and introduces to Elizabeth as a shared activity. Later in the novel, Elizabeth decides to continue with the activity, regardless of Calvin, despite her initial willingness to learn, being motivated by a desire to show that women are capable of doing it. She uses her love of science to learn the physics of the sport, and quickly excels, demonstrating not only that she is capable of navigating new, traditionally masculine territories, but also that she does it her way. Elizabeth's brilliance and her refusal to accept limitations for herself are both on display when she is rowing. Chapter 10. The Leash. Another letter from the person claiming to be Calvin's mother, arrives for Calvin. He reflects on the fact that his alleged father has never written to him. Calvin's pen buddy Wakely was the only person in the world to whom he had confided about his biological father. However, Wakely had entirely stopped responding after Calvin said he hoped his father had died. Calvin has never told Elizabeth about his father because he is afraid of how she may respond. Elizabeth had never walked 6:30 on a leash before the city implemented a leash rule, since he is a very smart dog. As Calvin goes for morning runs with 6:30, Elizabeth persuades him to utilize the leash. Elizabeth can't sleep on one gloomy rainy day, so she arrives to work early. Calvin decides to hurry to work, meet her there, and bring 6:30 with him. That day, 37 minutes after leaving the house, Calvin passes away. Chapter 11. Budget Cuts. Calvin and 6:30 jog by the police station on their way to work. Budget shortages have prevented the policemen from having their vehicles inspected and tuned up. As Calvin and 6:30 pass several of these vehicles, they start to backfire, which concerns 6:30, since it brings to mind his bomb-sniffing training. To run in the opposite direction of Calvin, 6:30 tugs on his leash. Calvin stumbles on some engine oil on the street, hits his head on the pavement, and is then run over by a police cruiser. When the police officers hustle to get Calvin an ambulance, 6:30 is already aware that there is no chance. 6:30 goes home, sick with sorrow, to inform Elizabeth of Calvin's death before the ambulance comes. Chapter 12. Calvin's parting gift. Elizabeth is grieved by Calvin's passing, and feels responsible for it because she insisted on the leash. There are a lot of rowers and scientists in attendance at his burial. With their hearts broken, Elizabeth and 6:30 stood aside from the throng. A writer who wants to do a piece about Calvin approaches Elizabeth and interprets what she says as meaning that Calvin was a jerk, and that she was only an acquaintance who didn't know him for very long. The following day, Donati and her co-workers avoid Elizabeth since they don't know what to say to her. She enters Calvin's lab and is horrified to see that everything has already been cleaned and the notes have been boxed up. Elizabeth discovers the diamond ring he had purchased for her in the container holding his personal belongings. Elizabeth is discovered by Frask at the lab, and he informs her that despite their unusual relationship, Elizabeth is not permitted by law to look through Calvin's belongings since they are being held for any potential blood relatives or next of kin. She brutally informs Elizabeth that she can no longer use Calvin's protection as an excuse to bring 6:30 into the lab, and prohibits her from doing so in the future. In the piece, which Frask displays to Elizabeth, the reporter who contacted her makes the implication that even his girlfriend didn't know Calvin well, since he was a difficult guy. As Elizabeth vomits up, Frask informs her that she could be pregnant. Chapter 13. Idiots. Hastings faces a challenge as a result of both Calvin's passing and the critical article. Their sponsors begin expressing a desire to re-evaluate the Institute's programs and the financing for each. There aren't many other intelligent scientists in Hastings, and of those that are left, Zott is one of the most competent. Management is reluctant to give her any real authority or chance, though, because she is a woman. They even lied to the investor who was supporting the abiogenesis study, saying Mr. Zott was the one doing the job. After that, they invested the investor's funds in various endeavors. Elizabeth's pregnancy is discovered by management when Ms. Frask broadcasts the information widely. This makes matters more difficult since the investor can learn that Mr. Zott is a woman. Donati dismisses Elizabeth, even though she is the inspiration behind the team research project she is a part of. Elizabeth learns that Calvin had interfered, and had been the only true reason she had been permitted to continue her abiogenesis study, as she attempts to counter that he had no legal basis to dismiss her for being pregnant. Chapter 14. Grief. Visited Calvin's cemetery at 6:30 and reads the headstone. Calvin had informed Elizabeth that on average dogs could learn around 50 words, but at that moment 630 already knew more than 100. Elizabeth had been teaching him words. Elizabeth had started actively teaching 630, and keeping note of the phrases he knew, after becoming certain that he was unique, and would be able to learn more. Moreover, 630 had started speaking inaudibly to the unborn child growing inside Elizabeth, calling it creature, and informing it about Calvin's passing. Elizabeth demolishes the apartment's kitchen 3 months after Calvin's passing, and replaces it with a lab. Since being fired, Elizabeth's former co-workers at Hastings have been coming to see her and asking for her assistance with their work. Elizabeth started charging them for this, earning a living by doing other people's work without any credit. At the cemetery, 630 speaks with Calvin, informing him of Elizabeth's lab, her ongoing efforts to teach 630 words, and the fact that she was still erging. 630 does not believe that any of this is beneficial to the creature, and he seeks a means of expressing hope to Elizabeth. 630 is discovered by the cemetery groundskeeper, who then tries to kill him. However, the dog rushes out of the path, knocking the groundskeeper to the ground. As the groundskeeper develops a head injury, 630 staunches the blood flow from the wound and barks until help arrives, recalling how Calvin had bled to death. The same writer who wrote about Calvin also shows up and creates a story about the dog who simultaneously saved a man's life and grieved his owner. The dog restriction at the cemetery is relaxed, and the groundskeeper is fired. Chapter 15. Unsolicited advice. Every time Elizabeth goes outside, she starts to receive unwanted advice from people as her pregnancy starts to become apparent. She eventually makes an appointment with Dr. Mason, the rowing team's physician captain. Dr. Mason examines Elizabeth like he would any other patient without passing judgment on her pregnancy, noting the distress it must be causing her. Elizabeth is moved by the fact that he is the first person to express any empathy for her, or acknowledge that not every woman aspires to be a mother. When Dr. Mason learns that Elizabeth has continued to urge, he is both startled and impressed. He concludes that Elizabeth's strength and health had been strong during her pregnancy, and extends an invitation for her to row with the team once again, a year after she has given birth and has healed. She is given confidence that she would manage delivery and recover from it just fine, when he says that she was a terrific rower. Chapter 16. Labor. Elizabeth and 60 went to the library to return some books, 5 weeks after their consultation with Dr. Mason. While Elizabeth is certain that she is still 2 weeks from giving birth, 630 has observed that her water has already burst, and the hunger pains she is reportedly experiencing are pre-Eobor contractions. Elizabeth collapses in pain as they get closer to the library. 13 hours later, Madeline is delivered unharmed. The following day, Elizabeth leaves the hospital against the doctor's advice and goes home, where she finds 630 waiting outside. Elizabeth and Madeline are greeted by the dog, and for the first time in a long time, they feel like a happy family. 10 minutes later, Madeline starts to scream, shattering the euphoria. Chapter 17. Harriet Sloane. Elizabeth is overwhelmed by a newborn who won't stop wailing, a to-do list that never seems to end, and the resulting lack of sleep and rest. A weary Dr. Borowitz arrives with a present for the infant and a plea for assistance. Elizabeth agrees since she needs the cash, but as soon as Borowitz departs, she falls asleep. When Mrs. Harriet Sloane, a neighbor, arrives to check on Elizabeth and the wailing infant, she wakes her up from a Calvin-related dream. When expressing Elizabeth her sympathies for Calvin, Harriet comforts and transforms Madeline. Her attempt to make Elizabeth a cup of coffee is cut short when she sees the lab. Instead, Elizabeth prepares the coffee using several intricate stages and lab tools, and Harriet declares it to be the greatest coffee she has ever tasted. She provides her phone information for Elizabeth to contact anytime she needs a hand, and expresses regret for not coming over sooner because she had believed Elizabeth had help. Because she isn't experiencing any blissful moments and has wanted to give Madeline away at least twice, Elizabeth admits that she feels like a lousy mother. She is reassured by Harriet that it is natural to feel this way, and that being a mother is a demanding and difficult job. Before she departs, she gives Elizabeth the advice to set aside time each day for herself, in which she is the only focus, and reconnects with her true passions. Chapter 18. Legally Mad. From the beginning of their relationship, Harriet had peered at Calvin and Elizabeth through her curtains, and had found their compatibility to be almost supernatural. Because Mr. Sloane is boring, stupid, insensitive, rude, and intolerant, Harriet's marriage is unpleasant. He was not just ugly on the outside, but Harriet believed he was actually hideous. Elizabeth is still in awe of the new Madeline, and wonders where the name came from. Elizabeth thought the nurse was asking her how she was feeling after a tough delivery, when in reality, she was asking for the name of the baby. Mad was the response Elizabeth gave, and that's what appeared on the birth certificate. When 630 gets an idea for the baby's name, he takes Elizabeth's copy of Memory of Things, which mentions Madeline. Elizabeth sees the book and immediately thinks of the name Madeline, just as 630 had meant. Madeline continues to be known as legally mad, since Elizabeth is unable to legally alter her name, because doing so needs several different paperwork, including a marriage certificate. After their initial meeting, Elizabeth calls Harriet hundreds of times. 4 days later, she finally succeeds in doing so. Harriet, who has been anticipating this, and has been keeping an eye on Elizabeth through binoculars, immediately comes over. Chapters 10 to 18 Analysis. The storyline dramatically changes in these chapters, as Elizabeth becomes a single parent, following Calvin's passing and her unplanned pregnancy. While the former is already a significant setback, the revelation of the latter is made worse by the fact that she ultimately loses her job as a result of it. The predicament of Elizabeth serves as evidence for the subject of patriarchy and women's aspiration. Even though Elizabeth is one of the Institute's few remaining competent scientists after Calvin's passing, they are afraid to offer her any real influence or opportunities, since she is a woman. The storyline dramatically changes in these chapters, as Elizabeth becomes a single parent, following Calvin's passing and her unplanned pregnancy. While the former is already a significant setback, the revelation of the latter is made worse by the fact that she ultimately loses her job as a result of it. The predicament of Elizabeth serves as evidence for the subject of patriarchy and women's aspiration. Even though Elizabeth is one of the Institute's few remaining competent scientists after Calvin's passing, they are afraid to offer her any real influence or opportunities, since she is a woman. Miss Frask plays a significant role in this, highlighting how women compete with one another and contribute to the barriers that restrict their chances. This emphasizes the negative connections that sexism in the workplace, especially among women, may foster. Women get pitted against one another in a struggle for survival, when a workplace provides little space and opportunity for them to achieve. Elizabeth is devastated by Calvin's dying and her wrongful firing, but she does not crumble or give up. Instead, staying true to the level of independence and self-sufficiency she has shown up to this point, Elizabeth goes to work. Elizabeth converts the apartment's kitchen into a lab, to freelance as a scientist, and makes ends meet. The action is both literal and figurative, signifying the demolition of a room that is only used for domestic purposes, and its transition into a room where she can handle both work and home responsibilities. Elizabeth uses the lab, where she not only works but also cooks to support herself. At Elizabeth's home lab, gender roles blur, which is appropriate for a woman who will soon be a single mom. In these chapters, the concept of motherhood is brought up sometimes, from Elizabeth's unintended pregnancy to the letter Calvin receives from a lady claiming to be his biological mother. Elizabeth is comforted and glad to learn that Dr. Mason has unexpectedly acknowledged that not all women desire to be mothers. As she has never had a mother to look up to, Elizabeth is understandably anxious about taking on the role of mother. She neglects her health for a significant portion of her pregnancy, finally seeing Dr. Mason at the end. Elizabeth is overwhelmed by the type of unpredictability and relentlessness that a baby brings, and starts to question her capacity as a mother when Madeline is eventually delivered. Harriet, Elizabeth's neighbor, is introduced, and she offers Elizabeth not just practical assistance with the infant, but also comforts that her sentiments are normal. Motherhood is challenging, stressful, and not always pleasurable. Elizabeth receives some important advice from Harriet, including the need to take time out for herself each day to reconnect with and commit to her true passions. The only two persons in Elizabeth's life who seem to show any comprehension or empathy for her situation, as well as nuanced acknowledgement of the many roles and gray zones in a woman's life, are Harriet and Dr. Mason. One of the arguments Garmus is attempting to convey in the book is that most discrepancies and conflict patterns between men and women are the results of conditioning and upbringing, which is further emphasized by the fact that reassurances come from both a man and a woman. For both Elizabeth and 630, Madeline's presence gives fresh meaning to the notion of the family. For the first time since Calvin's departure, there is a sense of being a whole unit. Elizabeth's daughter was born out of wedlock herself, and her dog, who is a literal embodiment of the underdog because of his enhanced intelligence and perceptiveness. This is Elizabeth's atypical, new family unit. 630 is aware that Calvin will soon die away, even before it really happens. As the ambulance won't be able to help, he slips away to tell Elizabeth the dreadful news. Elizabeth continues to teach 630 new terms in appreciation of his extraordinary intelligence, and 6 command 30s of the language is demonstrated when he assists Elizabeth in coming up with a genuine name for Madeline. While Elizabeth hasn't gone into labor, 630 is observant enough to know that she has. He also demonstrates the capacity to recall and use prior knowledge when he uses what happened to Calvin to stop the groundskeeper's blood flow and save his life. Together with his owner, 630 serves as the ultimate emblem of undervalued intellect and intuition in the novel, and has certainly grown into a vital member of Elizabeth's family. These chapters continue the themes of chemistry, food, and rowing. The excellent coffee Elizabeth makes for Harriet in her home lab combines chemistry and cuisine. Similar to what the home lab itself implies, this merging of themes denotes a melting together of the professional and domestic worlds of Elizabeth's life at this time. Dr. Mason is surprised that she has continued to row during her pregnancy, even though she claims that it has increased her strength and stamina. Elizabeth finds that rowing serves as a constant reminder of her relationship with Calvin and of her sense of self, which keeps her going through her pregnancy. Chapter 19. December 1956. Madeline is raised with Elizabeth encouraging her to discover and learn about her surroundings, while Harriet and 630 keep her safe. Mother and daughter have an adoring and educational connection. As promised, Dr. Mason pays a visit to Elizabeth a year after the birth to check on her and to extend an invitation for her to join the team for a row. Dr. Mason insists, saying that she couldn't possibly be busy at 4:30 a.m., which is when they would argue, despite Elizabeth's surprise and claim that she is busy. Harriet is perfectly happy to watch Madeline at this time, much to Elizabeth's surprise, since she is keen to leave her own house because her husband's drinking and shouting are getting worse. Elizabeth is treated with suspicion and contempt by the other rowers, just as she was the first time she rowed with the squad. Once more she feels unqualified, but Dr. Mason reassures her that she performed admirably and extends an invitation for her to continue rowing with the team. Chapter 20. Life Story. When Madeline is almost 4, even though she is still too young for kindergarten, Elizabeth enrolls her in school by altering her birth date on the certificate. Madeline is already physically bigger than most 5-year-olds and is reading at a 6th grade level. Elizabeth's decision is driven partly by her concern over Madeline's shyness and introversion. Madeline also displays an uncanny ability to sense exactly those things everyone wanted to hide. In a chalk drawing she does of her life, among other things, she draws a shower of tears, explaining that it represents Elizabeth's sadness. Elizabeth decides to go back to Hastings and look for work, because her finances are becoming worse. Donati, who appears relieved to see her, concurs, but Harriet disagrees, particularly in light of how they treated her and Calvin. Due to the abiogenesis investor's return and request to view Mr. Zott's work on the subject, Donati rehires Elizabeth. Borowitz replies that he has information on abiogenesis, when Donati asks the other chemists if they have anything to share. Nevertheless, he is unable to explain his research. Borowitz asserts that after talking about the matter with Elizabeth, he happened to get the same findings that she did. Chapter 21. EZ. Donati gives Elizabeth a new lab coat to wear upon her return. It now says EZ rather than the previous Zott, to the amusement of her fellow scientists. Elizabeth is surprised that Donati even knows about the work she has done on abiogenesis, when he requests to see it all. She was aware that Borowitz was the only one who may be aware of it, since she had observed him looking through her papers the previous time he had visited her. Donati refers to Elizabeth as luscious, and informs her that, contrary to what they had first planned, she will be working as a lab technician. Before leaving for a meeting, he gives her a flyer for a dictation correspondence course that Hastings is ready to pay for. Elizabeth runs into Frask, who is angry about having to report to a young guy who is a recruit, rather than having been promoted herself. Elizabeth is informed that the investor has returned and is now inquiring about Mr. Zott's abiogenesis research, accusing her of assuming a male identity. This is denied by Elizabeth fiercely, and a verbal argument ensues. Throughout this procedure, both ladies learn that their thesis advisors had sexually attacked them, which led to both of them being expelled from their PhD programs, Elizabeth in chemistry, Frask in psychology. Chapter 22. The Present. Mrs. Mudford, Madeline's teacher, writes a message home from the first day of class, wanting to see Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks Frask for additional information about the abiogenesis investor, a few weeks into her position as a lab technician at Hastings, but there isn't much to be found. As retribution for how she had previously treated Elizabeth, Frask unlawfully sends Elizabeth all of Calvin's work that had been packaged and stored in storage before she is dismissed by her new supervisor for gaining weight. Chapter 23. KCTV Studios. Walter is concerned about how to fill the open afternoon programming slot, because if he doesn't, his employer will fire him. He only tolerates his employer out of a desire to keep his job and support his daughter, Amanda. Because he is Amanda's only dad, Walter would sacrifice anything. He recalls Elizabeth's recent visit, when she expressed her displeasure at Amanda stealing her lunch. Elizabeth also learns that Donati stole her study and published it as his own in Science Journal, citing Borowitz as a co-author, 2 months after Elizabeth started working as a lab technician at Hastings. She snaps at Donati and Borowitz before quitting. When Madeline learns that Elizabeth had a conversation with Amanda's father, she is appalled. At home, Harriet informs Elizabeth that she has been receiving calls from Walter. Elizabeth insists that stealing is still immoral after being reminded of Donati and the paper, despite Madeline's explanation that Amanda provides a meal that is not normal. Also, Madeline brought a letter from Mrs. Mudford home. Both Amanda and Madeline are despised by Mrs. Mudford. Amanda because she thinks the girl is difficult and doesn't like the fact that her father, not her mother, is in charge of her education, and Madeline because, in addition to having advanced reading and comprehension skills, she also insists on doing things that boys do, like kick a ball. One specific message bemoaned the way Madeline has been asking the library for Vladimir Nabokov's books. Elizabeth is informed by Madeline that she dislikes school. Elizabeth recalls some of the Calvin letters she had discovered in the boxes Frask had given her, when she was asked whether they were destitute. Elizabeth received many offers from famous colleges, but she picked Hastings, the position that paid by far the least, because Wakely had previously claimed that Commons, California, where Hastings is located, has the best weather in the world. When Calvin was a student at Cambridge, Wakely was enrolled at Harvard Divinity School, and the two men regularly communicated on faith and science. Elizabeth was surprised to learn of the final conversation, in which Calvin declared his hatred for his father and wish for his demise. Elizabeth had assumed Calvin's parents were passed away. She also discovers letters from people claiming to be members of Calvin's long-lost family, including the lady who claims to be his biological mother and offers him funding for his study. Over dinner, Walter calls once again and pitches Elizabeth on the concept of a food program that she would host. Elizabeth contemplates taking the position, even though she detests the concept of being relegated to making food on TV for housewives, because of the decent income and the fact that she needs the money after abandoning her job at Hastings. Chapter 24. The Afternoon Depression Zone. Phil Lebensmull, the executive producer at KCTV and Walter's employer, tells Walter to dress Elizabeth in skin-tight apparel and have her pour a drink after each show to make her appear sexy on television. Elizabeth, on the other hand, proposes that she wear a lab coat in place of every single possible outfit, claiming that the gowns are uncomfortable. Also, she requests. Notice the lab supplies she has requested are stocked in the set's kitchen, but Walter lies and says they aren't quite ready. In actuality, the set has been prepared for some time, albeit with the equipment that Walter knows Elizabeth will detest, and merely designed to resemble a perfect, good housekeeping kitchen. Elizabeth is informed by Walter that her job is to amuse the viewers, particularly given that her program would broadcast immediately following the afternoon depression zone of television time. Between 1:30 and 5 p.m., productivity normally declines for everyone during this time of day. Children's programs or game shows that are designed to let the brain rest are frequently shown around this hour. But because of the overwhelming amount of work that still has to be done, housewives feel compelled to persevere through this slump. By 4:30 p.m., when people are starting to come out of their slump, Elizabeth's program, Dinner at 6, will go on the air. According to Walter, Elizabeth owes it to her audience of women to motivate them for their next duty, cooking supper. Thus, she must be entertaining. After learning that Elizabeth is single and that Madeline's father has passed away, Walter begs Elizabeth not to tell the show's producers about these facts about her past. Walter also admits that he is not the biological father of Amanda. He still has a great love for the child, despite everything. They also learn that Mrs. Mudford has called them both in to talk about their separate children, and they get along, since she incorrectly thinks that each of them is an unsuitable parent for a different reason. Walter ultimately proposes that Elizabeth wear anything from her clothes for the performance, even if donning a lab coat is out of the question. Chapter 25. The Average Jane. While the show is being live-taped, Elizabeth enters the set for the first time wearing a dull dress, a number 2 pencil in her hair, and test tubes in her hands. Even as the cameras are rolling, she describes the set as revolting and leaves to speak with Walter, causing the team to go to the commercial. Walter tells her that the set cannot be altered since it was constructed with the average Jane in mind, and Elizabeth should speak to her. Elizabeth entirely disregards the cue cards as she reappears in front of the camera. As Elizabeth talks about how wives, mothers, and other women's work goes unrecognized, and how she vows to accomplish something significant with them in the 30 minutes she is on air, women viewers are intrigued. After the show, Lebensmull shouts at Walter in a rage and threatens to axe the show. Elizabeth declines Walter's request for her to read the cue cards, claiming that her morality forbids it. Her show also receives a lot of phone calls from viewers seeking clarification on the shopping list Elizabeth mentioned on the program. The other program Walter broadcast in the afternoon slot had 0 phone calls. Chapter 26. The Funeral. After 15 days of broadcasting, Walter is worn out. When she is cooking, Elizabeth keeps pushing for a new kitchen location on set, ignores the cue cards, and gives the audience scientific information. To show her how dull her approaches are and to motivate her to be more interesting, Walter invites a live audience. To Walter's disgust, Elizabeth cleans up her kitchen area before the start of the performance, distributing the majority of the props to the audience members in attendance. While discussing the spinach's nutritional advantages, she continues to cut it for the casserole. Children, prepare the table. She emphasizes that cooking is chemistry, exhorts her audience to take chances, and closes the presentation with her trademark sign-off. Your mum requires some alone time. Walter imagines his burial as the show is being recorded. Rosa, his secretary, and Elizabeth awaken him by informing him that his heart rate was raised and that he had been hunched over. Elizabeth hands him the spinach casserole she just finished making for her family to eat at home. Amanda considers it to be the nicest food she has ever eaten, despite his protestations that she detests spinach. Chapter 27. All About Me. Mrs. Mudford gives the class a family tree project in May 1961. These trees are a terrible attempt to make you feel like someone based on someone else, as Harriet accurately deduces from Mrs. Mudford's nosiness and her displeasure with the task. Speaking with Madeline, Harriet discovers that several of Madeline's classmates bring leftovers of the identical meals that Elizabeth prepares on the show, indicating that their families are viewers. Harriet is surprised since she didn't anticipate such a huge audience for Elizabeth's cookery demonstrations and chemistry courses. Because of this, Harriet had been advising Elizabeth to play along with what the show's producers and sponsors wanted her to do, like smile more. Elizabeth, however, had adamantly declined to do so, because she didn't want to perpetuate the myth that women are incompetent. Harriet is Elizabeth's lone friend, and although they often agree on things, Elizabeth completely rejects Harriet's belief that men and women are fundamentally different, and that the former requires the nurturing of the latter. Elizabeth believes that the restrictions imposed on women, and the elevation of males as superior to women, are purely cultural in nature rather than biological. Harriet reassures Madeline that she knows sufficient about her father to complete the family tree, accidentally disclosing that Calvin had a godmother of sorts. Madeline is concerned that she doesn't know enough about her father to complete the genealogy. As Harriet was looking about Calvin's house, she once found this. One day by accident, he left the front door open. Before locking it for him, Harriet glanced around inside and found a letter from the boy's home, where he had grown up, asking if Calvin would be prepared to make a gift, as they had lately lost a significant contributor. Harriet responds to Madeline's additional inquiries about the godmother by saying that she was a fairy godmother, a benefactor who sent money to the orphanage. Despite Madeline's reservations, Harriet advises her to keep the family tree project a secret from Elizabeth. Madeline's inquiries annoy Harriet, so she gives up and brings her to the library. Chapters 19 to 27 Analysis. Elizabeth supports Madeline's exploration and experimentation in the environment as a parent. Elizabeth's personal experiences, particularly concerning her career ambitions, are in sharp contrast to this. For instance, Donati's decision to rehire her is solely the result of pressure from the abiogenesis investor. Along with rehiring Elizabeth as just a lab assistant, Donati takes advantage of the situation to steal Elizabeth's work with Boryweitz's assistance and publish it under his name. This situation demonstrates unequivocally that women can work just as well as men, and in Elizabeth's case, may produce superior outcomes, underscoring the fact that the bias against women often originates from a confluence of ignorance and insecurity, as in Donati's case. Both Elizabeth and Ms. Frask are victims of this injustice, as she is made to report to a recruit who is a far less experienced young man than she is. Yet, Garmus again emphasizes that not only males are responsible for maintaining patriarchal order. Mrs. Mudford disapproves of Madeline because she insisted on doing things that boys generally do. Elizabeth's personal experiences inspire her to give Madeline more freedom of expression as a parent, allowing her to express and enjoy herself by her own authentic beliefs, rather than conventional ideas of femininity, just as Elizabeth designs her kitchen and cooking show to suit her tastes. Elizabeth, who left Hastings in protest of Donati's robbery, makes a desperate start at dinner at 6. Frask is also let go for the same degrading reason, gaining weight. The concept that women may be reduced to their outward looks and sexuality keeps coming back. For example, Donati calls Elizabeth luscious, and her new lab coat has the letters EZ on it, which is a double entendre designed to imply that she is sexually promiscuous. Lebensmühl instructs Walter to make Elizabeth appear sexy even when Elizabeth starts hosting dinner at 6. Unsurprisingly, Elizabeth doesn't give in to these demands. The harmful connections that sexism in the workplace had previously been demonstrated to produce are reversed when Elizabeth and Frask learn that both of their thesis advisors had harmed them. The discovery that two women had the same experience, in the same industry and circumstance no less, is evidence of how frequently males in positions of authority misuse their authority at work. This is not an isolated incident, it occurs frequently enough to reconcile two ladies who were at odds. These chapters go into some detail about the subject of family. Elizabeth and Madeline had a close relationship, despite all of her early concerns and reservations. In contrast, Walter Pine's daughter Amanda grows up without a mother. His wife abandoned him and their child, and Walter is now a single father like Elizabeth, but for very different reasons. Mrs. Mudford, Madeline and Amanda's teacher, has misgivings about both kids in part because of their family situation. She distrusts the home with a single father equally as much as she does the one with a single mother, Elizabeth. Despite this, Garmus shows that Walter and Elizabeth are both devoted parents, who do their best to raise their kids under the given conditions. The fact that Walter is not even Amanda's biological father raises new concerns about the significance of biological connections. Harriet's response to Madeline's family tree assignment, which Harriet rightly deduces to be the result of Mrs. Mudford's innate nosiness, further disavows the overvaluation of biology. In these chapters, two important characters, Phil Lebensmühl and the benefactor at Calvin's boys' home, are introduced. Like Myers, Donati, and Borowitz, Lebensmühl belongs to the group of males who are power-hungry and disrespectful of women in both attitude and deed. The donor, who is still anonymous, is starting to take on more significance in the narrative. Harriet's awareness of the situation and the details she tells Madeline further evoke an extended family that transcends biology. As Madeline reconstructs her family history and learns about the varied definitions of family, Harriet serves as a knowledgeable guide and a second mother to her. Elizabeth has entirely changed her career path away from being a chemist, but she still incorporates it into her current position by teaching science and cooking. She now prioritizes cooking because she is the TV host of Dinner at 6. In an ironic twist, Elizabeth can support her family, which is a traditionally masculine obligation, thanks to a traditionally feminine activity. In the book, rowing plays a similar function, developing into an atypical setting where Elizabeth is free to both succeed and have fun. Rowing is one of the few things Elizabeth does that is completely simple for her and has nothing to do with her career, her gender, or her position as a mother, unlike cooking and chemistry. Chapter 28. Saints. Madeline approaches the library staff for assistance in locating the address of an Iowan boys' home. Wakely, who is now a reverend and is also in the library, overhears the talk and uses the little data Madeline is aware of to assist in locating the property. They talk about how Wakely sometimes finds his job challenging, and Wakely explains to Madeline the distinction between secret and private while acknowledging that everyone harbors secrets, including himself. When Wakely and Madeline finally locate the All Saints boys' home, they find that there is simply a phone number posted instead of an address. When Wakely agrees to contact Madeline's house on her behalf, he is shocked to learn that Calvin Evans is Madeline's deceased father. When Calvin's remarks at a conference Wakely was attending at Harvard pleased Wakely, the two of them started a written communication. Even though they frequently clashed, Wakely and Calvin had a good relationship. Yet, a horrified Wakely had no idea how to react when Calvin had admitted to wanting his father dead, essentially terminating their pen-pal connection. Years later, after his father's passing, he had come to Commons and assumed control of his congregation. Upon discovering that Calvin was also in Commons, he had intended to locate Calvin, but Calvin had passed away before he could do so. Wakely had offered to preside over the illustrious scientist's burial, and had even run into 630 and Elizabeth there. Wakely witnesses Madeline displaying a family photo from the funeral that was included in the news article. It depicts Elizabeth, Calvin's coffin, and 630. Madeline says that she was inside Elizabeth at the time. Wakely is moved by Madeline's comments and the situation, and he makes the unwavering claim that families aren't supposed to fit on trees. Before leaving, Madeline shares a secret with Wakely, who then shares a secret of his own with her. Wakely is astounded by what Madeline tells, but she reassures him that his situation is not that horrible. Chapter 29. Bonding. Elizabeth describes several chemical linkages before demonstrating how to prepare a chicken pot pie in an episode of the program. Walter is concerned since Lebensmühl extended Elizabeth's contract for an additional 6 months, with the only stipulation that the science is rejected and sexy be introduced. Women appear to enjoy Elizabeth's use of technical words on the show because it makes them feel capable, yet she still rejects every proposal Walter offers. While she has some additional time at the end of the program, Elizabeth answers a question from the audience. Using some of the ideas Elizabeth had previously introduced in prior episodes, the woman asks Elizabeth a thorough inquiry regarding the edema on her leg. Elizabeth questions the housewife, who likes to read medical publications in her free time, and finds out that she once had an ambition of becoming an open-heart surgeon. The audience roars in approval at this discovery. Elizabeth tells her that it is never too late to follow her dreams. In support of the woman's fearless future, she also gives her a chicken pot pie that Elizabeth had just baked. Chapter 30. 99%. Mrs. Mudford calls Elizabeth to discuss the inappropriate family photo Madeline sent in with her family tree. Elizabeth is informed by Harriet that he has gotten calls from the LA Times and the First Presbyterian Church's minister, who both request an interview with Mad and Elizabeth, respectively. Elizabeth is hesitant to participate in the interview, since she knows family-related topics will be raised. Walter phones Elizabeth to express his sympathy over the fact that Amanda is having problems with the family tree as well. Also, he tells Elizabeth that Lebensmühl is not pleased with the direction the play is taking. Walter asks Elizabeth to include a can of soup from one of the sponsors Lebensmühl is wooing on one of the programs. Walter stops Elizabeth from meeting Lebensmühl in person, despite her desire. The week only gets worse. Mrs. Mudford starts chatting up the parents about everything she has found out about the kids and their families, revealing that Madeline was born out of wedlock and Amanda doesn't have a mother. Elizabeth finds out that she is making a lot less money than the other employees at KCTV, and that profit-sharing privileges are only available to male employees. Mr. Sloan, in a fit of passion, throws a beer bottle at Harriet, hurting her. Harriet refuses to let Elizabeth contact the police because she believes she can handle Mr. Sloan on her own. Elizabeth is enraged. The week's events prompt Elizabeth to disparage the sponsor's soup on television by calling it loaded with toxic ingredients. Before instructing the audience on how to prepare a broccoli mushroom casserole, she goes on a tirade about women not receiving the same pay as their male counterparts, and describes how to murder someone by feeding them deadly mushrooms. Rosa, the makeup artist, cautions Elizabeth not to go alone when Lebensmühl requests to see her at 7 p.m. Elizabeth disregards this and continues to meet with Lebensmühl, who confronts her and rants at her to frighten her. When that fails, He informs her that she and the other dinner at 6 employees are all fired. Elizabeth says that Lebensmüller wants to dismiss her because he wants a show that reinforces societal norms and limits an individual's capacity, and she does so without becoming upset. Lebensmüller starts to strip in front of Elizabeth, putting his genitalia in her face in one last effort to assert his dominance. A 14-inch chef's knife that Elizabeth calmly removes from her luggage causes Lebensmüller to immediately pass out. Chapter 31. The Get Well Card. After suffering a heart attack, Lebensmüller spends 3 weeks in the hospital and then a year in bed recovering. Work is out of the question during this time. When Walter learns that Elizabeth was present when it occurred and that she was the one to dial 911, he is astounded. He is even more appalled to discover that, despite Walter's warnings, she went to see Lebensmüller alone in the evening. Elizabeth reveals to Walter that Lebensmüller shot them all before attempting to kill her, but failed because he suffered a heart attack upon seeing Elizabeth's knife. Elizabeth had been looking over the show's paperwork at Lebensmüller's office, looking for syndication and fresh sponsorship opportunities, as she waited for the ambulance to come. The play wasn't going as poorly as Lebensmüller had led Walter and everyone else to assume. Walter takes over as executive producer in an acting capacity, syndicating Dinner at 6 throughout the nation and securing new sponsorship deals that significantly increase revenue. He gives a status report on Lebensmüller to everyone at KCTV, and when the news of his heart attack is announced, cheers are heard. They send Lebensmüller a Get Well card that is handwritten by everyone at the channel, with some of the sentiments expressing how despised Lebensmüller was. Walter writes, "May you never recover," buoyed by this and Elizabeth's straightforward admonition to him as he assumed his new role, to do the right thing. Chapter 32. Medium Rare. For Madeline to attend the Dinner at 6 sets and witness her mother live, Harriet forges Elizabeth's signature and sneaks her out of school. They want to enter by the emergency escape and stealthily take a seat in the back row. Seymour Brown, a security officer, tells Harriet and Madeline that while there has been a long line of people waiting to attend Dinner at 6 since 4 a.m., they will not be allowed inside since the studio audience has already been chosen. To express to her mother how difficult his work is, Madeline requests the guard to sign his name in her notebook. Seymour complies and is shocked to discover Madeline's surname in the notebook. As soon as they enter, Walter's secretary gives Harriet and Madeline front row seats. After being persuaded that Elizabeth cannot see her audience at all because of the dazzling lights, they agree. Madeline is proud of Elizabeth as she runs the program, but she also experiences a tiny bit of envy when she realizes how many other people have to share their mother with them to see her on television. Walter requests to speak with Harriet and Madeline to find out why the latter is not attending school. Walter adds that Elizabeth is only attempting to shield Madeline from the lack of privacy that comes with celebrity. If Elizabeth finds out that Madeline is on the set, she will be furious. Madeline asks Walter why he thinks Elizabeth is so well liked, and Walter responds that it's because she cooks excellent meals and speaks her mind, which is unusual. As the program comes to a close, Walter starts to get a lot of calls when Elizabeth confesses that she is an atheist in answer to a question from the crowd. Chapter 33. Faith. Before 1960, a public declaration of atheism was unheard of. As a result, Walter started receiving threats from sponsors and fans who wanted Elizabeth to suffer terrible consequences. During a particularly trying day, Wakely is questioning his faith, while Elizabeth urges Walter to have faith that all will be well. As he enters his office again, he discovers Frask, his new part-time typist, watching Dinner at 6 while she works at the machine. Frank reveals to Wakely that she had collaborated with Elizabeth before both of them were let go by Hastings. Madeline is questioned by Wakely about why she didn't let him know that her mother was watching television. Madeline believes that everyone knew, especially in light of Elizabeth's admission that she doesn't believe in God. Wakely informs Madeline of his follow-up with All Saints, where the secretary finally informed him that they had no record of a Calvin Evans at their residence, after several unsuccessful attempts to contact the bishop. Madeline feels certain the secretary is telling the truth. Chapter 34. All Saints. The bishop at All Saints recalls how in 1933, he had been given the task of finding long-term finance for the boys' home in the middle of Iowa, with the directive that he should do it before being moved to a better location. After struggling for his first 4 years, he eventually found success in 1937, when a guy named Wilson claimed to be from the Parker Foundation, a wealthy Catholic charity. He intended to take the youngster back with him, and was looking for Calvin Evans. To get the money, the bishop told Wilson that the kid had passed away. Wilson, who was astonished, consented to create the Calvin Evans Memorial Fund at the residence, with the funds designated towards sports and science. Years later, when Calvin was featured on the cover of Chemistry Today, Avery Parker of the Parker Foundation called the bishop, furious that she had been misled and that the endowment had been essentially cancelled. The bishop has been avoiding Wakely's call right now, since he is sick of the problems Calvin has given him in the past. Wakely phones the residence once more, pretending to be a benefactor, wishing to donate money to the location where Calvin Evans was raised, to disprove Madeline. He gets connected with the bishop right away, who accidentally reveals that the Parker Foundation had supported the Calvin Evans Memorial Fund at the home, while acknowledging that Calvin had been reared there. Wakely informs Madeline of this knowledge and the Parker Foundation's post office box number, implying that Wilson was Madeline's fairy godmother. Madeline is perplexed as to why the foundation initially provided cash for a monument for her father, who was still alive, then withdrew it. She reminds Wakely that while religion is founded on faith, the opposite isn't true, and she reiterates her confidence that she will find the truth. Chapter 35. The Smell of Failure. When one of Elizabeth's viewers asks for a diet suggestion, she recommends rowing as an alternative type of exercise. Elizabeth, therefore, finds the boathouse packed with ladies who are all taking her advice when she next walks down. Picketers gather outside KCTV to protest Elizabeth's atheism. Elizabeth seems unfazed, but Walter worries since she's been receiving a lot of death threats. Elizabeth's television viewership includes a non-clapper, which worries 630 as well. He descends to the studio and makes his way past Seymour till he sees Elizabeth there. Inadvertently revealing that Madeline and Harriet had also visited, Seymour states that 630 is Elizabeth's puppy. By telling a lie that Madeline had visited because of a watch your parent at work day school assignment, Walter can appease an irate Elizabeth. Walter unknowingly agrees to include 630 on the show when Elizabeth introduces him to her. 630 becomes a crowd favorite and starts receiving his fan mail. While this is going on, the dog is still on high alert for the non-clapper. He locates her in the audience once more, and during a break he can approach her and smell the nitroglycerin in her purse. The luggage is successfully taken out and moved close to Seymour by 630. Sticks of explosives are found inside, along with pamphlets calling Elizabeth a godless communist, and Seymour calls the police. Subsequent research revealed that this woman, fed up with being ignored, was the source of all the death threats. Chapter 36. Life and Death. Life magazine approaches Elizabeth about doing an interview, but she declines since she is certain they would demand personal information. As they become closer, Walter finds himself falling in love with Harriet and asks her for assistance in persuading Elizabeth to take the interview. The next week, Franklin Roth from Life comes to see a live recording of the program. He learns via his encounters with Elizabeth that she is being forced to take the interview. He apologizes and departs after refusing to interview someone who is being forced to do so. At Elizabeth's request, Seymour halts him and she then drives Roth home. Elizabeth discusses her work on abiogenesis with Roth while demonstrating her lab and the erg Calvin constructed. Roth takes a gamble and inquires about Calvin Evans since the interview is uninteresting and dull. Roth feels as if he has betrayed Elizabeth's confidence, since she is immediately shocked and outraged. But eventually, she starts to speak and tells him their tale. Chapters 28 to 36 Analysis. Elizabeth's popularity on Dinner at 6 is growing, and her star is getting brighter. Regardless of Lebensmill's repeated warnings to axe the program if Elizabeth doesn't alter her behavior. In flagrant defiance of the restrictions put on her personality, abilities, and potential, Elizabeth continues to build a real relationship with her audience, emphasizing the connection between patriarchy and women's aspirations. Elizabeth's rising fame serves as a testament to the value of representation, because her unabashed uniqueness inspires other women and gives them more power. After her near assault by Lebensmill in these chapters, she has a vastly increased sense of empowerment that affects both the private and public worlds. With the cookery program and the chemical lab, there is widespread public undervaluation, violence threats, and belittling. Moreover, it can be seen outside of closed doors in the discreet disputes and close calls with strong men in her field that she has to deal with. But Elizabeth's tenacity, fury, and independence are also present in both contexts. She can inspire both enormous crowds of people as well as herself when confronted by Lebensmill. This highlights how Elizabeth's public character influences her personal life, and more crucially, how her struggles and triumphs have a positive impact on a large audience. Wakeley is first mentioned in another place in the narrative when he encounters Madeline and learns of her relationship with Calvin. He is one of the few people who reassure Madeline that she shouldn't place too much importance on her biological links while determining who she is. Mrs. Mudford, who is opposed to Madeline and Amanda's family circumstances herself, is on the opposing side of this debate. She disapproves of the family tree assignments they submitted. Mudford has a strict and intensely traditional attitude toward family when he engages in parent-to-parent chit-chat regarding Madeline's paternity and Amanda's lack of a mother. Despite Medford's displeasure, Elizabeth repeatedly demonstrates that she is a wonderful mom, as seen by her desire to shield Madeline from the spotlight. Madeline manages to see Elizabeth on set, despite Elizabeth's objections, because of her understanding of how it might badly affect a small kid. Madeline is both proud of her mother and envious of all the people she gets to share Elizabeth with. Wakeley supports Madeline as she looks for additional information about her father, as a result of her family tree project. These chapters contain several significant story aspects, including the discovery of Calvin's residence by Wakeley and Madeline, as well as revelations concerning the donors and how the bishop misled them about Calvin. To set up the sequence of events that would lead to the climax, Miss Frask is reintroduced into the plot and discovered working as a typewriter for Wakeley. Elizabeth consents to a Life magazine interview, and surprisingly finds up telling the reporter Roth a lot about her personal history. Along with the main narrative's progress, a secondary plot has 6:30 making yet another display of his amazing intelligence and insight, when he recognizes that Elizabeth may be in danger from a non-clapper in the audience, and prevents a bomb from going off on stage. Chapter 37. Sold Out. Roth hears Elizabeth talk about her love for Calvin and how they were soulmates. She details how Donati took her research and published it as his own, how Calvin acknowledged her work ethic and ability, which is uncommon for a guy to do, and what transpired at UCLA. Elizabeth divulges to Roth details about her upbringing, Calvin's early life and background, his passing, and the remorse she feels over it, as well as how his passing sparked a string of failures in her own life. Roth receives a plethora of personal material from Elizabeth, but he chooses not to write about any of it in favor of an essay on abiogenesis. The editor of Roth demands to know the dirt on Elizabeth, but Roth disputes that there is any. When the article is finally released 2 months later, it has undergone a considerable transformation. It now emphasizes Elizabeth's beauty and included quotations from her father, Dr. Myers, Mrs. Mudford, and Donati, who refers to her as Luscious Lizzie. The fact that Mrs. Mudford also sent a photograph of Madeline's family tree showing Walter as a family member among other things, has led some people to believe that Elizabeth is having an affair with him. The magazine runs out of stock in less than a day. Chapter 38. Brownies. Dinner at 6 experienced a meteoric rise in popularity in July 1961, as a result of the Life article. Roth's apparent betrayal of Elizabeth hurts her, and she declines to answer his calls. She bakes brownies on the program numerous days in a row, out of her melancholy caused by the story. Madeline reads the article over Harriet's orders not to, and is outraged by how unfairly her mother is depicted. Instructing her not to answer the phone or leave the house one evening, Harriet leaves for a while. Before Wakely can leave after checking on Madeline, Elizabeth also shows up there. Wakely is a familiar face to Elizabeth from the funeral. Elizabeth learns from Wakely that Roth has published a separate essay. A few days ago, Roth visited Elizabeth's house, but Madeline refused to let him in on Harriet's orders. Madeline examined the contents of the manila envelope Roth put on the door before taking it to Wakely. Madeline had left the envelope with Frask while Wakely was away, and Frask had told Wakely that Madeline had been really unhappy. Now that Wakely has given Elizabeth the envelope, she discovers a brand new, unpublished article inside with the heading, "Why Their Minds Matter," and the subtitle, "The Bias of Science and What These Women Are Doing About It." Roth apologizes in a letter that is included with the paper. He has left Life and is seeking to have this piece, which includes the truth, published elsewhere, but 10 scientific journals have already rejected it. Chapter 39. Dear Sirs. Frask recognized Madeline when she appeared in Wakely's office 2 days earlier, with the manila envelope, because she resembled Calvin. Madeline was informed by Frask about her relationship with Elizabeth, and how much in love Calvin and Elizabeth had been. The youngster breaks down as Frask accidentally reveals that Elizabeth was sacked because she was carrying Madeline. Frask promised to deliver the mail to Wakely on Madeline's behalf before she went. After reading the contents of the envelope, Frask addressed a letter to the editors of Life, claiming that everything in the story was fake, and outlining the true events at Hastings, including the theft of Elizabeth's study by Donati, and his misuse of cash by deceiving investors. The following issue of Life has several letters from women who have supported Elizabeth around the nation. One of them is Frask's letter, which Harriet eagerly wants to present to Elizabeth, but she is uninterested in. Even Roth's unpublished piece, which was turned down by many scientific journals, is unable to lift her spirits. Nobody appears to be interested in reading about women in science. It's not your imagination, most people are horrible, Madeline discovers when she opens her lunchbox later that morning. Harriet and Madeline are concerned about Elizabeth's apparent sadness in November 1961. Harriet has an idea of who would truly be interested in reading about women in science, as they mull over what to do. Chapter 40. Normal. One evening, Wakely and Elizabeth debate what is typical while sitting on the back step of her home. She admits that she has read Calvin's letters, and that Wakely's assessment of the weather was the reason Calvin accepted the position at Hastings. Wakely reflects on the secrets he shared with Madeline. She told him that 630 knew 981 words, and he told her that he didn't believe in God. Wakely overhears Elizabeth discussing her regret over her brother John's suicide. Elizabeth needs to forgive John and accept herself to go forward, according to Wakely's premonition. Wakely responds that Elizabeth's issue is not that she wants out, but rather that she wants to get back in, despite Elizabeth's admission that she knows how John felt and occasionally wants out, as well. Chapter 41. Recommit. Elizabeth makes a retirement announcement at the start of each dinner at 6 episodes, stating that this will be her final one. She had driven to Walter's the day before to tell him about her choice, and had seen Harriet there as well. Walter and Harriet are dating, but they are keeping it a secret until Harriet's divorce is finalized. As Walter and Harriet heard Elizabeth's news, they both started crying. Elizabeth expresses gratitude to the audience for supporting her, for their friendship, and for making history. She provides an update on Marjorie Phyllis, a housewife who as a young girl dreamed of becoming a surgeon. Phyllis finished her pre-medical coursework quickly and was admitted into medical school. Elizabeth exhorts all the female viewers to have the guts to alter things. She acknowledges Harriet Sloane as a valued friend and expresses gratitude for the words of wisdom she once provided Elizabeth, telling her to take a minute each day to reconnect with herself. Elizabeth closes the performance with a command that Walter comes up with on the fly and holds up on a cue card. This concludes your introduction to chemistry class dismissed. The crowd erupts in raucous applause. Chapter 42. Personnel. Despite the popularity of Dinner at 6, Elizabeth has not gotten a single offer from a college or research facility since leaving the program in January 1962. Elizabeth is informed by Harriet that a Miss Frask has been requested by Hastings' head of personnel. Elizabeth responds that Frask isn't at Hastings, instead, she works for Wakely as a typewriter. When Elizabeth makes a follow-up call, Miss Finch, Frask's secretary, answers. As Elizabeth is put through, Frask congratulates her on a magazine cover feature piece and invites her to come in as soon as possible with 6:30. The abiogenesis investor has returned after getting in touch with Frask after reading Elizabeth's letter in life. A star-struck Finch begs Elizabeth to sign her copy of Vogue as she and 6:30 enter Frask's office. Elizabeth's image appears on the front of the magazine, along with the caption, "Why Their Minds Matter." Roth's unpublished essay was forwarded to Vogue by Harriet, who eventually gave up after waiting 4 months for a response. The piece was nonetheless released. Elizabeth and 6:30 are brought by Frask to Calvin's former lab, where the investor required they meet. Elizabeth arrives to find Wilson and Avery Parker waiting for her. They warmly welcome her and extend an invitation for her to continue her work on abiogenesis at Hastings. Donati shows up to see Wilson as Elizabeth is about to turn away after declining the offer. Donati is startled to meet Avery and dumbfounded to find Elizabeth and Frask there. Wilson, who is now Frask's attorney, tells Donati that he has been dismissed because of Frask's letter in life, which prompted the foundation to conduct some research and lead to the discovery of a number of his transgressions. After recently acquiring a controlling stake in Hastings, the foundation decided to make adjustments. Elizabeth has been offered Donati's previous position as director of chemistry, and Frask has been named the new head of personnel. Elizabeth takes a moment before giving Donati a pen and saying that he is just not smart enough. Avery then delivers Donati a termination letter to sign, and says that the choice about his job status should be made by someone who truly understands his field. Chapter 43. Stillborn. Wilson also makes a passing reference to Calvin Evans' unfinished work when Avery and Wilson reaffirm their offer to Elizabeth and talk about renovating the facility. Elizabeth solves the riddle between the wealthy benefactor at Calvin's house and the guy Calvin identified as his father in his journals. When Avery offers to talk with Elizabeth alone, Elizabeth becomes hostile because she thinks Wilson is Calvin's blood cousin and is here to steal and use Calvin's findings. When Elizabeth questions Avery about Wilson, Calvin, and All Saints, Avery responds by telling Elizabeth the following tale. A 17-year-old girl was taken away by her parents to a Catholic home for unmarried mothers after she became pregnant out of wedlock. She was repeatedly urged to sign away her unborn child, but she refused. As a result, she was kept in a room alone when her labor started, and the doctor ultimately put her to sleep because he had had enough of her screaming. She was informed that her kid had died shortly after birth when she came to. A nurse at the facility got in touch with her 10 years later and offered to tell her the truth in return for money. Her son had been adopted by a family who had perished in a series of sad events, following which he had been sent to a boys' home in Iowa. Since then, Avery, who is Calvin's biological mother, has been looking for him. Chapter 44. The Acorn. Elizabeth is astounded and wonders suspiciously why Avery hasn't come forward sooner. She reveals that although the bishop had misled Wilson into believing Calvin was dead, she had sent Wilson, her foundation's lawyer, in her place. As Calvin's father had been a rower, Avery then decided to donate money to the house, with all of it designated for science and sports. When Avery ultimately saw Calvin on the cover of Chemistry Today, she realized the truth. She immediately stopped supporting them and started writing to Calvin. Suddenly, Elizabeth realizes that the letters from the distraught mother had been signed, Avery Parker, after all. Avery approached Calvin with caution after learning the truth. Due to Avery finding out that Elizabeth and Calvin were dating, Wilson had come to Hastings to provide funding for Elizabeth's studies. Donati had first tried to discourage Wilson before telling a lie about Elizabeth being a guy. Calvin went dead before Avery or Wilson could contact him directly, and Elizabeth's work came to a complete halt. Even though Elizabeth was misquoted as stating she hardly knew Calvin, Avery and Wilson had attended his burial, and the story that followed depicted Calvin as a tough man who harbored resentments. Elizabeth cries out that Calvin was the nicest thing that had ever happened to her, and that she had loved him with all of her heart. Elizabeth cries uncontrollably as she rests her head on Avery's shoulder. Chapter 45. Supper at 6. Avery divulges that Madeline wrote to Wilson regarding the family tree she had created, and that had been published along with the life piece. Wilson, according to Madeline, had sponsored the home where Calvin had been reared. Avery was inspired by Madeline's information to look into it further, and over time, she was able to piece together the narrative. When Elizabeth inquires about Calvin's biological father, Avery reveals that he died of TB before Calvin was even born. Elizabeth reacts by sharing information about her first encounter with Calvin, after Avery recalls how she first met him. Elizabeth informs Avery that she is already a member of her family, and that she wants to learn more about Calvin. Before Avery and Wilson depart, Elizabeth extends an invitation to them and Walter, Harriet, Madeline and 6:30 for supper at 6 in her home lab. She adds that they will eventually have to meet Mason and Wakely as well, the whole family. Once they leave, Elizabeth and 6:30 set to work in the lab, resuming her investigation into abiogenesis. Chapters 37 to 45 Analysis. In the book's concluding chapters, justice is seen to be done in satisfying ways for all the many characters and plot lines. Beginning with the crisis of the life article, which calls Elizabeth luscious and severely damages her self-esteem, the plot wraps up its flashbacks and returns to the book's beginning. A variety of things happen as a result of this sad situation, building up to the story's conclusion. Each character's professional duties are jumbled and untangled until everyone receives what they are due, good and bad. This happens for Elizabeth, Frask and Roth in a good way, as they get the recognition and jobs they wanted, and it happens to Donati as Elizabeth dismisses him with the same insult he used on her years earlier: he's just not clever enough for the job. Maybe the best example of Elizabeth's genuineness and integrity throughout the novel is her choice to leave dinner at 6 and return to the field of research. She entered the cookery program out of need, but she did it on her terms, and she also left the program on her terms. Elizabeth dramatically leaves the program, and the episode ends on a positive note, with an update from Mrs. Phyllis, the aspiring heart surgeon, who has finished her pre-medical coursework quickly and has been accepted into medical school. Elizabeth continues by mentioning Harriet and expressing gratitude for the wise counsel she received from her when Madeline was born, to take time for herself each day, reconnect with others, and recommit. Elizabeth similarly exhorts her listeners around the nation to have the guts to change. Harriet has assimilated herself into Elizabeth's unusual family, as seen by the depth of Elizabeth's friendship with the older woman, and how much she has grown to mean to her. With Walter Pine, Harriet is forming yet another significant bond in her life. She is also the one who submits Roth's essay to Vogue, after experiencing a brainwave. As Harriet aggressively strives to divorce Mr. Sloane and move on to brighter things, her life is starting to substantially improve. The narrative ultimately emphasizes the point that a woman's values or well-being are determined by her empowered choices rather than her environment. Only after being summoned by Frask to Hastings, where Miss Finch asks Elizabeth to autograph her copy of the magazine, does Elizabeth learn of the Vogue piece. The story's last unfinished threads are now woven together. Elizabeth and the reader ultimately see the big picture after Donati is fired, and Avery reveals her history and connection to Calvin. Family is a major theme at the book's conclusion, much as Frank's letter in life inspired Avery and Wilson to look into Donati. Madeline's letter to the Parker Foundation, which included a family tree, inspired them to look into Calvin's background. At this point in the novel, although Calvin has long ago died away, his tale finds some closure when Avery informs Elizabeth about Calvin's father, the circumstances of his birth, and the reason why she was unable to get in touch with him while he was still living. Among the ensemble of characters in the novel, Avery is yet another unusual mother. Elizabeth also had an unmarried child, and Avery now has the opportunity to do the same with her granddaughter, after losing the chance to get to know her son while he was still alive. Elizabeth extends a warm welcome to Avery, saying that she has to get to know the whole family, which includes Madeline, 630, Harriet, Walter Wackley, and Dr. Mason. Elizabeth's television culinary career comes to an end in these latter chapters, and she shifts her focus back to chemistry. As the tale draws to a close, the division of science and cookery stands in for Elizabeth's professional salvation. She is ultimately successful in creating a healthy and gratifying division between her personal and professional responsibilities. As a result, these two recurring themes receive important nods towards the conclusion of the story. Around 6 o'clock, Elizabeth hosts a dinner, but this time it is only for her family and is held in her own house. And with 6:30 at her side, she returns to her study of abiogenesis, with the rightfully earned position of Hastings head of chemistry. Characters. Elizabeth Zott. The main character in the novel is Elizabeth Zott. She used to work as a chemist before becoming a single mother at 30, and starting her career as a television cook on the quickly rising popularity Dinner at 6. Elizabeth is incredibly gorgeous and smart, but sometimes the former gets in the way of others seeing the latter. She had a daughter named Madeline with Calvin Evans, with whom she has a love relationship, but Calvin passes away before Madeline is born. Elizabeth's family after Madeline is born consists of Madeline, her dog 630, and Harriet, a neighbor who helps with childcare while Elizabeth is at work. She is alienated from her parents and has no other family members to speak of. Her elder brother committed suicide when she was a little child. During her time as Walter's producer at KCTV, Elizabeth also develops a personal bond with him. Walter is the one who creates Dinner at 6. When it comes to her profession, Elizabeth is intelligent and stubborn, traits that hurt her at the beginning of her career. Donati aggressively seeks to marginalize Elizabeth and undermine her self-esteem, because he detests her for being intelligent and opinionated. He must yet admit, if only to himself, that Elizabeth is the only other talented scientist at Hastings, aside from Calvin. Elizabeth is a unique television personality because of her seriousness and candor. To Walter's dismay and Lebensmann's ire, she insists on presenting scientific knowledge on the broadcast in addition to her culinary instructions. She is incredibly well liked, despite this, due to a combination of her attractive presence and the respect with which she addresses her audience of housewives. Elizabeth is determined, resourceful, and independent as a result of her life experiences. Because of her father's work as a god salesman, she is an atheist, and has an incredibly logical and analytical attitude toward life. Her independence is also a result of being left to fend for herself from an early age, including educating herself using books from the neighborhood library. During her interactions with Myers, Donati's unfair treatment, and even Lebensmann's attempted attack, Elizabeth dares to defend herself. Along with her innate brilliance and talent, Elizabeth's self-sufficiency results in her refusal to accept boundaries, either for herself or others around her. In the course of Elizabeth's character arc, she experiences a series of injustices at the hands of various people and organizations, but she perseveres and, by the end of the novel, has been given justice and atonement. She develops from an unloved, unsupported and endearingly unusual single mother, to a professional woman employing her abilities at the top of her field, surrounded by her loving, supporting and unconventional family of choice. Calvin Evans. Elizabeth's romantic interest and partner is Calvin Evans. Calvin, a renowned science prodigy and great scientist, works in his lab at Hastings. He is Madeline's father, but due to his untimely passing, he was never able to meet her or learn of her existence. After his adoptive parents passed away, Calvin was reared in the All Saints Boys' Home in Iowa. He feels as though he has a biological father who does not want him, and Calvin will harbor a grudge against the guy for the rest of his life. Calvin is unusual, particularly in the way that he respects Elizabeth, as an equal partner and with respect. He appears to have little regard for gender in his dealings with others, or his opinions of them, since he places a far greater importance on a person's intelligence and ability. He is in love with Elizabeth because she is brilliant, and she is in love with him because he admires her intelligence. Calvin may have unconventional views on gender, but he is still seen to exhibit some implicit attitudes related to the topic. For example, he initially wanted to marry Elizabeth because he thought it would legitimize their relationship as a family. He also believed Elizabeth was a secretary when they first met. The connection between Calvin and Elizabeth is significant in the context of the book. It exemplifies what an enjoyable, healthy and mutually satisfying relationship should be like, and implies that the foundation for this is a dynamic built on respect and regard for one another. Several of the book's important events begin with Calvin's death, which also places Elizabeth in the situations that drive the plot forward. Mad Zott and 630. Elizabeth's family is made up of Madeline Zott and 630 following Calvin's passing. Elizabeth's daughter Madeline was given the legal name Mad due to a misunderstanding with the hospital nurse. She is 6 years old when the book begins and is a bright but reserved youngster. After following Elizabeth home from the town one day, Calvin and Elizabeth decided to adopt the dog they named 630. The reason 630 failed as a bomb-sniffing camp trainee was that he was unable to get over his aversion to explosives. It is shown that Madeline and 630 are both much smarter and more sensitive than anyone had assumed. When Madeline starts kindergarten at age 4, she can read at a 6th grade level and has a natural ability to pick up on people's innermost thoughts and sentiments. Similar evidence suggests that 630 is far smarter than the typical dog. After the book, it is revealed that he has learned 921 words and counting. In addition, he has a thorough understanding of his surroundings and can express his ideas and feelings in reaction to them. Elizabeth is cherished by Madeline and 630, who is very protective of her. Madeline is concerned about Elizabeth when she experiences sadness following the life story. She is also disturbed when she learns that Elizabeth's pregnancy is the reason she was dismissed from Hastings, preventing her from pursuing her chemical career. Similar to Elizabeth, from the time she is pregnant and grieving Calvin, 630 is continually concerned about and keeping an eye on Elizabeth's well-being. He recognizes the possible threat posed by a woman in the cooking show audience who is not applauding, and goes on to locate and defuse the bomb in her purse, saving several lives while overcoming his phobia of explosions. Together, Madeline and 630 show how a loving, supportive family may be formed up of unexpected components, like a kid born out of wedlock and an extremely smart dog. Harriet Sloane and Walter Pine. Elizabeth's next-door neighbor is Harriet Sloane, and Amanda's father is Madeline's classmate Walter Pine, who later works as Elizabeth's producer on Dinner at 6. The only friends Elizabeth has in her life since the birth of Madeline are Harriet and Walter, who provide her with professional and personal support systems, respectively. Due to her miserable marriage, Harriet is lonely and seeks company. As a consequence, she visits Elizabeth when she has a new baby, and gradually notices that she helps out with Madeline frequently. Even if she and Elizabeth don't always agree, Harriet is still Elizabeth's closest supporter. In the series finale, Elizabeth thanks Harriet for a crucial piece of advice that helped her get through the challenges of parenthood and a job. The amount of presence and brilliance that Elizabeth emanates initially astounds and awes Walter, prompting him to recommend dinner at 6 to her. Despite Walter's many concerns about Elizabeth not complying with Lebensmühl's demands, the show, a desperate attempt to retain his job, becomes a smashing success. Walter has a protective attitude towards Elizabeth, even though her actions frequently put his employment in jeopardy. He works to prolong the show's contract, tries to meet her wishes as much as he can, and protects her from Lebensmühl. Even though he is aware that he is not Amanda's biological father, Walter is a loving and committed single dad to her. This demonstrates Walter's inherent goodness. In the end, the interactions Walter and Harriet have with Elizabeth are beneficial to both of them. Harriet feels valued for the first time in her life when Elizabeth recognizes and values all that she does. Similar to this, Elizabeth encourages Walter to act morally by assisting him in taking charge at KCTV after Lebensmühl has a heart attack. Elizabeth loves Walter and Harriet just as much as she loves them. They end up being Elizabeth's adopted family, and ultimately develop love and feelings for one another. Dr. Myers, Donati, and Phil Lebensmühl. Characters like Dr. Myers, Donati, and Phil Lebensmühl are examples of patriarchy and sexist beliefs and actions toward women. Myers oversaw Elizabeth's doctorate at UCLA. At Hastings, Donati oversees the chemistry department. At KCTV, Lebensmühl serves as executive producer. In their areas of employment, all three of the men occupy positions of authority and influence, which they all abuse in various ways. After attempting a sexual assault on Elizabeth, Myers has her fired from the show after she retaliates. Donati actively sabotages Elizabeth's career because she is a woman. He prevents her from conducting crucial research, misleads investors and reappropriates funds intended for her work, fires her when she becomes pregnant, then rehires her only to steal her work and publish it as his own. Donati is an insecure man who hates both Calvin and Elizabeth because they are more talented than him. Elizabeth's persistent unwillingness to fit into this pattern infuriates Lebensmühl, who views women as little more than sexual or domestic objects. As a result, Lebensmühl tries to intimidate Elizabeth before finally sexually assaulting her. Despite the trauma, Elizabeth perseveres through her interactions with each of these guys, becoming stronger and more capable with each one. By the end of the book, she feels vindicated for each of these incidents. Despite not having a PhD, thanks to Myers, she is retained as head of chemistry at Hastings after Donati is fired, and she gains enormous popularity at Supper at 6, assisting Walter in boosting the show's revenue after Lebensmühl is forced to leave due to a heart attack. Themes: the patriarchy's limitations on women's aspiration. The type of restrictions patriarchal systems and organizations inflict on a woman's aspirations is a key issue discussed in the book. Elizabeth's biography, and specifically her career trajectory, which faces various obstacles throughout the novel, serves as the best illustration of this. Elizabeth is a chemist at Hastings until Donati reassigns her to a low-level study, although she initiated the group research project she is on. After this, Donati forbids her from continuing with abiogenesis research. Due to Elizabeth's deviation from the norm for women in her day, Donati is motivated by his disdain for her. Donati disagrees with her for being intelligent and outspoken, and in an intentional effort to undermine Elizabeth's self-esteem, he says she isn't clever enough. Donati tells Elizabeth this in front of her, but proceeds to get money for the institute because of Elizabeth's efforts. When Elizabeth is eventually rehired, Donati assigns her a lab tech post while also stealing her research and publishing it under his name. He then lies to Wilson about Elizabeth being a guy, before using the money for other projects. Donati's behavior shows that he is aware of Elizabeth's potential and feels threatened by it, since it may compromise his performance. Donati represents the idea that limiting the achievements of women may be driven by insecurity just as much as ignorance or overt sexism. Similar restrictions apply to Elizabeth at KCTV, where Lebensmal tells Walter to make Elizabeth seem sexy rather than intelligent. At their discussion, Elizabeth confronts Lebensmal about this, pointing out that because housewives are the intended audience, Lebensmal wants a program that restricts people's potential in general and women in particular. Yet, Elizabeth is not the only character that has these restrictions. Despite having significantly more experience, Frask is denied a promotion and forced to answer to a new employee, a young man, while Mrs. Mudford forbids Madeline from asking insightful questions or reading sophisticated literature. Even Avery lacks direct control over her own foundation and must rely on Wilson, a man, to manage her affairs. Nonetheless, some of the characters had happy endings. Elizabeth is offered the job of head of chemistry at Hastings, and Miss Frask is promoted to head of people. Mrs. Phyllis is admitted to medical school, and a piece about her is published in Vogue. All of these examples serve as evidence for the thesis that Garmus advances throughout the narrative. If given the freedom to pursue their potential unrestricted, women might do anything. Workplace sexism and harassment. One of the book's main themes is how women are affected by sexism and harassment at work. Sexual assault incidents are a major component of this issue, but the book also examines sexist workplace attitudes and how they affect women's employment and interpersonal relationships. Elizabeth discloses her previous interaction with Dr. Myers early on in the novel. Even though Elizabeth was able to repel Myers' assault, she is the only one to experience repercussions as a result of the incident, since her doctorate admission is cancelled. The university is aware of Myers' reputation as a lecher, but despite this, his reputation shields him from his conduct, allowing Elizabeth to suffer a double whammy, both the attack and her expulsion. Later, Elizabeth learns that Frask encountered the very same issue with her advisor, delaying the completion of her doctorate in psychology. The fact that both women had a similar experience shows how prevalent power abuse by males in positions of authority was at the time. The second time Lebensmal tries to attack Elizabeth, justice is done. He has a heart attack and is forced to leave the studio. The women in the novel experience sexual assault, as well as overtly sexist views, and the ensuing discrimination on the job. Both Donati and Lebensmal believe that women should play specific roles, and their treatment of Elizabeth shows that they are trying to pressure her into doing so. Donati says Elizabeth is not intelligent enough to work on abiogenesis, and Lebensmal tells Walter to make Elizabeth seem sexy for television. Also, Donati and Borowitz plagiarize Elizabeth's work and claim credit for it. Elizabeth doesn't openly protest this, since she is confident that no one would take her seriously. Elizabeth initially loses out on income at dinner at 6, just like she loses out on the job as a scientist at Hastings, which she recognizes when she sees that she is paid far less than her male co-workers. The workplace is dominated by males in so many ways that their active opposition to allowing women to achieve ultimately turns women against one another. Because women have fewer opportunities to succeed, every other woman is a competition, and every successful woman is deserving of envy. Towards the beginning of the novel, Frask exhibits this mindset by slandering Elizabeth and treating her cruelly. Only later in the book does Frask stop acting in this way, and the two ladies start to get along, since they had both experienced sexual assault in the past. Calvin, although an outlier, still mistakenly believes Elizabeth to be a secretary when they first meet, underscoring the pervasive chauvinism against women in the workplace. This demonstrates how deeply ingrained training is, and how anybody may develop implicit and unconscious beliefs and resulting behavior. As a result, Garmus contends that sexist beliefs about women and the workplace are profoundly embedded in the public as a whole. If uncontrolled and unasked for, it may show itself in a variety of ways, from seemingly harmless misconceptions like Calvin's to overtly damaging and trauma-inducing actions like sexual assault. Reviewing the definition of family. The definition of family is revisited in lectures in chemistry. The value of biological relationships within families, the social and moral perspectives of families, and the function of mothers within families are all issues that are examined in many ways. The discussion between Calvin and Elizabeth about their various upbringings casts doubt on the significance of biological relationships. Calvin, who was raised without a family, believes that a family is what gives stability. Thus, it is significant that he has come to understand that a family may also be a cause of suffering. Given that both Calvin and Elizabeth come from dysfunctional families, and that their relationship is more gratifying and meaningful when they choose to be together as a unit, this further emphasizes the dubious value of blood. The couple's decision to forego having children, and their adoption of a pet to care for illustrate how unusual arrangements may nonetheless create a strong sense of family. This is reinforced near the conclusion of the novel as well, when Elizabeth asks Avery to meet the whole family, and names several individuals who, aside from Madeline and 630, are primarily unrelated to her by blood: Harriet, Walter, Wakely, and Dr. Mason. In the book, the social notion of marriage is discussed about morality. According to the status quo, having a family is inextricably linked to the institution of marriage, since one has to be married to have children. Due to her unmarried pregnancy, Elizabeth loses her career. Similarly, Avery is compelled to give up her kid. Mrs. Mudford strongly disapproves of both Elizabeth and Walter for being single parents, even though they are loving, capable parents to their children. Family is also regarded to consist of two parents to a kid. This is true, even if Madeline and Amanda are not Walter's biological children, and Madeline was born out of wedlock. Another school of thought related to the family that is discussed in the book is the concept of motherhood. Elizabeth states that she doesn't want kids, and when she does unintentionally become pregnant, she questions her parenting skills because she never intended to have kids. It is Dr. Mason who reassures her that many women may not necessarily want to have children. While this is not an unusual thought, it is exceptional that Dr. Mason makes this point explicitly. Yet, Dr. Mason's analogy of parenting to rowing casts doubt on the notion that motherhood is something natural and intrinsic to women. It not only shows that both require patience, endurance, strength, and commitment, but also that parenting, like rowing, is something that must be practiced and is not something that comes naturally to everyone. Elizabeth's concerns are further allayed by Harriet, who reassures her that it's normal to be overwhelmed by motherhood, and uses her own mother as an example of how not all women are natural mothers. Garmus thus exposes these notions of the family as mostly social constructions that are ultimately up to each individual to define for themselves, by repeatedly showing examples of how various components of the family might exist differently than the expectations. Symbols and motifs. Chemistry. The theme of chemistry appears frequently throughout the novel, and is important enough to make it into the title. The subject of the circumscription of women's aspiration by the patriarchy is closely related to this. Although it is clear that both Elizabeth and Calvin are experts in the field, Calvin continually earns praise for his contributions, and has even been nominated for many Nobel Prizes. Despite her own comparable abilities, Elizabeth does not have anything like the influence that Calvin possesses in the workplace. In contrast, she is first expelled from the team research that she herself helped to organize, and then she is sacked and forced out of any scientific employment. Afterward, unable to claim any credit at all, she is compelled to assist her former co-workers with their job to make a living. Elizabeth develops her original methods to use and express her passion for chemistry in her cooking, while overcoming the various obstacles put in her way. She later returns to the topic entirely in a redeeming storyline, taking Donati's place as the head of chemistry at Hastings. Chemistry, which deals with the combinations, connections, and reactions between various substances, might be seen as a metaphor for the relationships, challenges, and choices Elizabeth encounters during the book. Every choice she makes, every interaction she has, and every dish she cooks are alchemical processes that result in the creation of something entirely new. Elizabeth's mastering, therefore, comprises both concrete and abstract chemical instruction. Cooking. The second repeating theme in the novel is cooking. Under the subject of sexism and harassment in the workplace, this idea of sexism is further examined. It emphasizes the idea of sexism regarding the conception and expectations around gender roles. Particularly during this historical period, cooking is usually considered a woman's domain because it primarily pertains to the home realm. By giving cooking and the task of the housewife the respect they both deserve, Elizabeth furthers the way she continuously challenges gendered expectations of herself. She also demonstrates how cooking can be a cerebral activity by examining the chemistry involved. Elizabeth uses science in cooking to make a living when she is forced out of science, a traditionally male-dominated field. This is because she approaches food as chemistry, which makes her an amazing cook. Because of this, she does not despise cooking as some preordained feminine job, but instead approaches it with rigor and discipline, concepts not typically connected with the stereotype of a housewife preparing dinner. Rowing. The third repeating motif in the text is rowing, which refers to various concepts at various stages. Elizabeth starts to row to show Calvin that women can be excellent rowers too. Despite the disastrous first classes, she swiftly and surprisingly learns the talent by putting in the effort to comprehend the science involved. This rowing demonstration connects to the subject of patriarchy and women's ambition by showing what women may achieve when given the opportunity. Dr. Mason provides a different viewpoint on rowing by equating it to parenting. As part of the topic of re-examining the meaning of family, the notion of motherhood is addressed, and the rowing motif is seen as a calling to this idea. Rowing and parenting are both equally different, but one is celebrated and taken seriously, with the participants being praised for their hard work and efforts, while the other is completely taken for granted. Dr. Mason's comparison of the two emphasizes the disparity in the value placed by society on the work done by men and women. Thank you for purchasing my ebook, Summary of Lessons in Chemistry. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope that this ebook has provided you with a useful and enjoyable overview of the original book. I value feedback from my readers, and would greatly appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to leave a review. Your honest review would not only help me understand what readers like you appreciate about my ebook, but it would also help other potential readers decide whether it's the right ebook for them. Your thoughts and opinions matter to me, and I would be honored if you could share them with the world. Thank you again for your support, and for considering leaving a review. CB Publishers. Copyright CB Publishers 2023.